Just to explain my role, I'm Steve Webb. I've been a partner here at LCP for the last 6 years. Prior to that, I was a Member of Parliament for 18 years and 5 of those as Pensions Minister. So although I probably know less about football regulation than anyone else in the room, I did spend 5 years responsible for economic regulators, the pensions regulator, and liaising with others. So hopefully I can chip in on what makes for a good regulator and what doesn't. I'm delighted to be joined by 3 experts who we'll hear from today. So first of all, we'll hear from Chris. Chris, as many of you will know, is an expert lawyer with many years across both football, rugby and cricket. He's currently head of regulatory affairs at the City Football Group, but has asked to make it clear he's not speaking in that capacity tonight. He and all the panelists are speaking personally. I can't imagine why that's important, but apparently it is. Crucially, Chris had a key role to play in the fan-led review, and he'll talk a bit about how that came about and what came from that. So it'll be great to hear from Chris very shortly. He'll then pass to Bill Bush, who spent 19 years at the Premier League, leaving last year as Executive Director and Senior Advisor, and his CV also includes time advising Cabinet Ministers and Prime Ministers. I don't know what that did for your impression of politicians, but we'll perhaps hear about that. And then to your right, a politician, Tom and I overlapped in Parliament for 5 years. Tom Greatrex has been chair of the Football Supporters Association since 2024, vice chair for 5 years before that, also a supporter representative on the FA Council, so very much bringing the fans' perspective. So my reflections on what makes for a good regulator is working out what problem you're trying to solve. So we thought we would start by asking that question. So the theme is, what problems was the regulator brought in to solve? What challenges will it face? So Chris, how did we get here?
Well, Steve, I think when considering the independent regulator and the fan-led review, a thing that was touched on earlier but that not many people are aware of is that it didn't spring out of nowhere. You know, there had been inquiries of different kinds into football governance by different bodies, but in 97, in 2004, in 2011 and 2013 and 2016. So they had been regularly discussing regularly issues about governance. Sorry, is that okay? Shall I stop you? Okay. So there were regular discussions about the appropriateness of football governance over decades. But what it led to the fan-led review, the longer-term cause was the collapse of Bury FC, and that led to a manifesto promise in the 2019 Conservative Party manifesto to hold a fan-led review of football governance. Very vague about what that would be. There were then, that sat on the shelf, and there were then two events that sort of supercharged what happened. Firstly, COVID, and perhaps not in an obvious way, but COVID required ministers and officials to be a lot more directly involved in what was going on in the game than they would have done otherwise. And I think they were quite surprised at some of the tensions that existed and some of the dysfunctional relationships. So I think that sort of primed them to be a bit more alert for other problems, and then the European Super League happened with the fan reaction to that. European Super League, interesting topic in its own right, but for a fan-led review perspective, what it meant was the terms of reference were much more extensive than I think they otherwise would have been, and it became a much bigger review than if it had happened straight away in 2019. So we did it over many months. We spoke to loads of people, including more than 130 supporter groups, clubs, leagues, experts of all kinds. So I'm happy to sort of stick my neck out and say I don't think there's been a more comprehensive look at the issues in English football today. And the conclusion we reached was there is a lot of good things about English football. The Premier League, as Anna mentioned, is hugely successful. We have something like 40 million grassroots players. We have more association football clubs than any other country in the world, which is remarkable given our relatively small size compared to some. We have a pyramid from the Premier League down to about 10, 11 levels, going down which is the envy of many around the world and in Europe. So there's a lot of good things, but it's possible to sort of say, yes, there are a lot of good things, but still be concerned about some of the issues that we were finding. And for me, I think the thing that tipped me over into why I thought an independent regulator was necessary was the issue of financial fragility. And it's a shame that Christina isn't here, because the research that one of the most instructive bits of research was done by Christina and Kieran Maguire. And it basically, they were commissioned by the government to look at, to say what indicates financial fragility and apply that to football. So they came up with 5 or 6 different methodologies, and then applying them to the game was quite sobering, because even in the Premier League, there were only 3 clubs that didn't have at least one of those indicators of financial fragility. When they did that a year later, sort of an update to reflect what had happened, there was actually only 1 club that didn't have any indicators of financial fragility. Manchester City.
Got the microphone on.
So we're concerned about financial fragility, and I guess my uncle that is a vicar will be delighted to know that in my head throughout a lot of this was the biblical story of Joseph, and you know how Egypt's okay because in the 7 years of plenty it puts reserves away, whereas the other countries in the 7 years of plenty don't prepare for the 7 years of famine. And in football for 30 years we've had the years of plenty, and we're still in this situation. So what happens when the TV money goes down, or when something happens? Hopefully it doesn't, but what happens if it does? So that concerned me. And some of the challenges we got on that was, okay, football clubs might go to the wall, so what? They're just football clubs. I couldn't disagree with that idea more. One thing that came very clear through the evidence was yes, there's an economic case for all of this, but there's a social and cultural and historical importance of football clubs within communities that is really unparalleled, I think, in any other sphere of activity. So we concluded that there was a problem and football clubs were worth saving. Looked at different options. Don't have time to go into it, but essentially there were 4 options. 1, leave it to the market, don't do anything. 2, leave it to the FA, the Premier League, or the leagues, or whoever to solve the problem. 3, co-regulation, where the government would pass an act of parliament still, but that would be giving statutory powers to some of the existing football bodies. And having concluded for various reasons none of those worked, we recommended an independent regulator. And all of the recommendations were accepted or supported, a very civil service distinction, by the government of the day. So I think on my part, rather naively, I thought, oh, this would be quite a straightforward process. It took 4 years, and by my calculations, in those 4 years, we had 5 DCMS secretaries of state, 4 prime ministers, 3 ministers of sport, 2 different monarchs, and a general election. So a lot more complicated than I thought it would be, but we got there in the end.
10 Man United, no, sorry. Chris, thank you very much for that. I can see we have a question on Slido. I'm not going to go straight to it, but just a reminder, if you've heard anything that Chris said that you want to violently agree or disagree with, get your questions in. People can upvote them, so if you see someone else's question, you like it, just put a thumbs up. And it'd be good to get lots of questions from the floor as we go. So Bill, just to stress, you're also speaking in personal capacity, I understand.
Definitely.
But do give us your sense of the problem we're trying to deal with here and what the challenges are, please.
No. Well, 19 and a half years, very annoyed not to make 20. So, and just for complete openness and balance, I've just agreed to join the IFR's expert panel. 3 hard-bitten, long-in-the-tooth individuals, David Davis from the FA, Steve Kavanagh from the Football League, Will, CEO, and myself. But don't expect me to provide any balance. So all the prejudice I show, though, will be mine and not belonging to any institution I may have worked for. I'm going to start by asking you to look deep into your souls if you're football fans and say, is financial fragility what motivates you to read sports pages and what motivates you to go to the game? How grumpy do you get if you hear that your club has turned a profit? Should be cheaper shirts, should be cheaper tickets, should be more players on the field. And in fact, the history of many sports, not just football, it's only grim monopolists like the NFL and so on, where profits can be made and guaranteed. In open market sports, you make losses because this happens. I'm spend this, then they spend that. Then they spend this, then they spend that, and so it goes. Real Madrid and Paris Saint-Germain set the pace for wages and other talent costs in European, to an extent, world football. And if English football wants to compete at the very top, it has to compete with them. And owners from top to bottom, except possibly Manchester City, look deep into their bank balance to see whether they can stay with it. Now, does this matter? Well, why do people go? People don't go to football matches or watch on TV because it's transactional. This is not a supermarket transaction or any other kind of straightforward value for money, is it worth it transaction. It's something else. It's excitement. It's hope. But where did excitement and hope come from? They are the flip side of the same coin of jeopardy and failure. And in fact, the vast majority of clubs fail, so that a very small number can succeed. And you know what? At the end of every season, you, as a fan, you probably looked at something less than you'd hoped for on that bright August morning that you stepped through the turnstile. And you know what? You're on the beach for a couple of weeks, you're missing football, what the hell? There's a pin all over the fence, whatever. You know, and you want football again, and your hope's there again, and your expectation is there again. Football is a hope, expectations, failure, and dashed expectations experience, and that's what people want. Now, I do actually agree that after many years of looking at this, the case for an independent regulator was very strong. There are two fundamental weaknesses, but others as well that the regulator will look at to tidy up. Two fundamental ones, which Chris of course touched on. One is the club failure. In the Football League in particular, but not just in the Football League, club owners embraced the cross-party consensus around the move to rescue culture for business. Going into administration is the Section 11 equivalent, I think, with borrowed from America. You go into administration with no stigma, you can wipe off your debts and start again. Very good idea if you're running a restaurant or a garage. Interesting incentive to an owner who can bet the farm to get promotion, fail, and then wipe out debt, possibly have a pre-pack, so that the new owner has a strange resemblance to the old owner, just with carrying slightly less debt. So that rescue culture word, which is hung around the Football League's neck as if they invented it, they didn't. It was a cross-party consensus that there should be stigma-free administration. And you know where 9 points and 10 points deductions came from? It was football introduced them to introduce, as it were, punishment for going bust. Football introduced it, not the government. So it's very important that you bear in mind this bubbling cauldron of hope, fear, panic, desperation. Maybe what drives the fan base. So the other reason, of course, with the European Super League, where breaking various principles of English and international football, it was a sort of to be an easy ride for big clubs. You had to have a good, strong reputation to get in there. This was about eyeballs, not about qualifying on the pitch. And there were various other weaknesses that could have been identified by the clubs involved if they bothered to do some decent investigation, but they didn't. And that's a huge, you'll remember that, huge outcry. So two major regulatory failures that needed sorting, and I think the regulator is well placed to deal with the first one, harder with the second. So this session is entitled Challenge or Opportunity. When I was invited in my presentation, I misread it. I read it as challenge and opportunity, because like many difficult things in life, it is both a challenge and an opportunity. Governments decided to take the opportunity, and I said very good reasons for it. I think business models, club business models, are now so diverged that the idea that self-regulation is sufficient breaks down when there isn't a kind of, as it were, the Venn diagram contains a big consensus of those doing the self-regulation and doesn't exist anymore. That alone is a reason for looking for external regulation. But very quickly, I want to run through 5 challenges which the regulator needs to bear in mind. They've got a huge task setting up the licensing system and the other things they have to do that are specifically their responsibility specified in the legislation. But the biggest test is not actually, rather terrifyingly, not whether they meet those, the licensing system must be an effective and accommodable licensing system, not too burdensome and so on. In a way, that's the easy bit. Difficult, but it's easier than the other bits. But the other bit, which is in the legislation, but doesn't have a very specific series of tasks attached to it, is to not mess the game up. There's another word that fans would use where I use mess, but I thought it might be a family audience, so I stick to mess. Don't mess it up. So, challenge number 1, somehow the regulatory impact must sustain investment, not reduce it. It's investment in talent, investment in facilities that drive quality. It's a quality that drives the fans. Second, don't harm competitiveness. It's really, really, really important that challenging clubs, whether it's Wrexham or Brighton or Bournemouth or Brentford, and these clubs exist all the way down to Salford. Who'd have thought the super rich of Manchester and Singapore, I think, would come in and create Salford, much to the annoyance of clubs at level 8, I think they started, who thought, we can't compete with multi-millionaires like Gary Neville and billionaires like Lynn, I think his name is. So they're annoyed, but actually it creates an interesting dynamic. That club moves up, and then those very rich people decide, League One a bit expensive, so we might settle down as a sort of League One yo-yo club. Investment, absolutely vital. Competitiveness, absolutely vital. Thirdly, one that isn't really talked about is the importance of capital value of clubs. That when you're looking to buy something, and the regulator, of course, is on a mission to get good, responsible owners, it's a capital asset. You want to know that you can sell the damn thing. What you don't want is a major risk that you take this expensive to run beast and then find it loses capital value while you own it. Another one that's not really talked about. Of course, the Premier League takes the lion's share of the money. It cascades quite a bit down. Has some indirect dynamic effects, which also help, like making sure that Premier League clubs drive value in the FA Cup and the League Cup and so on, and so on and so on. But if the money is to go down, even more than it already is, into Championship, League One, League Two, and who knows, maybe to National League as well. Why not? If the principles of Cliff Edge are carried through logically, you might think that's something that could be looked at. But we know, and Christine would say this if she were here, every study shows the more money you put in, the more spent on player costs. So unless you control player costs, more money you put in will merely increase player costs. So is it a policy intention, which it might be, or is it an unintended consequence if there were inflation in player remuneration and other player-related costs because of increased money being cascaded down? Which is why the other side of that, the ability to spend the money, the requirement to invest that money wisely, is an important part of the regulator role. To look at any sport anywhere in the world that depends on an open talent market. The top 10 tennis players earn an awful lot more than numbers 90 to 100. So in cricket, the gap between Stokes and a really good all-rounder in a second-tier league team, county team, is immense. There are immense differences. So you really need to cascade money down to sort of second-tier, third-tier, fourth-tier quality talent to get substantial pay increases. Bear in mind, Championship players at the moment, roughly $1 million, $1.5 million a year, not counting bonuses and all that stuff, something of that sort. Not obvious, but increasing player remuneration is a major objective. Last two, I promise. Two things about forecasting the future and what should the regulator do about this. One is, what does it do? Not about the ESL, that was seen off. It was seen off in about 4 days. It was a very exciting 4 days, but it was only 4 days. Never thought I'd been on a phone call with a prime minister, that prime minister. Done a couple of others. It's evolved European Super Leagues. It's where FIFA and maybe UEFA get together and create sanction competitions. We saw very little on last summer. Now, what if they have what you might call ESL features? What should an English and Welsh regulator do? What can it do? What can it do if they resurface in sanction competition? Interesting question. And lastly, again looking at the future, broadcast markets have been pretty good. I think I first read a series of prognostications from financial experts, economists and so on, that the broadcast market was unsustainable. I think I read this in 1995, I think. So 30 odd years of the bubble not bursting is a pretty good run. But maybe the vast consolidation, the technical changes, the market responses to those technical changes could bring about a huge shift in broadcast market valuations. Now, is that the kind of risk? Is that something that the regulator should take into account? If it doesn't, is it being irresponsible? If it does, if that means limiting expenditure, preventing clubs from overreaching, taking on debt that would be unseemly in a crash broadcast market scenario, does the regulator really want to get involved in that? So I think there's a series of challenges which are not the challenges set out, as it were, in the core duties, but are an immediate consequence that the media, fan groups, all the stakeholders will leap onto if there are any signs that things go wrong. I think the challenges are substantial, but recognise them is the first step to dealing with them.
Bill, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for putting questions in. If you can put your name on, that will be great. Otherwise, I've got several anonymous ones, which is a bit like heckling, I suppose. That's allowed. But
we'll work out.
Yes. If I tell you the question, you tell me you asked it. The top question has got 4 votes, which is getting towards the number of votes I used to get. So if everyone can engage, pick the ones you want to make sure you get questions asked. And so third, Tom, very pleased to have you with us to give us a fan perspective on what you've heard so far. So from the fans' point of view, what's the regulator trying to achieve? What are the big challenges?
Yeah, and I should say at the start, Steve, unlike Bill and Chris, I am unashamedly speaking on behalf of an organisation as well as myself, the Football Supporters Association. So why are football supporters, why has the FSA been involved in this through the whole of the process that Chris set out a few moments ago? It really comes back to something that Bill referenced, which is the features of English football, the pyramids, the jeopardy, the hope, the expectation, which can go both ways and actually is more likely to go negative than positive because only one team can win and plenty of others don't, is fundamental to why people turn up to football. That's what we love about it, that's what we want to protect, that's what we want to ensure continues. That doesn't mean that supporters in a raw matter are against change all the time. Sometimes we're portrayed as being the most conservative of anyone attached to football, but it does mean, I think, that supporters have a perspective, a take, an approach which is about the integrity of the thing that they love and disproportionately spend disposable income on in a way, again, as Bill touched on, not in the same typical consumer behaviour with any other product. You don't change your football team, very few people do at all. So that's why, in the origins of this, and I think Chris is right, it was August 2019 really when this became real. People remember Bury going out of business, disappearing effectively, have to be reformed and start again. They don't necessarily always remember that Bolton came that close to that in the same month. So we had 2 historic clubs that had won trophies, been around from the early days of professional football in this country, that came very, very closely to disappearing, and one did disappear. And what that left was a supporter base that felt bereft, because it wasn't their fault that this club ended up going out of business. It wasn't their fault that the community had lost resource, which was important economically as well as associated to the fabric of that area. and whose fault was it, and where did it end up? There's a complicated picture, but fundamentally it was because we got to a position where people who should not have been in charge of football clubs were in charge of football clubs. Now, the causes of that, partly, I think it's fair to say, are about the framework that enables people to take over clubs. Now, one of those took over, well, both of them actually in different ways took over already in a distressed state, but made it worse. And that's where, this really started. That's where the proposals in manifestos for review started, and then the sort of catalyst to make it actually happen was the Super League. I just want to touch on that European Super League point as well, because what that was really about, and it was a very exciting, in some ways, 4 days. So it was 4 days at a time when you couldn't go to football. It was during that period, but what we had was owners and people working on behalf of owners of a small number of clubs effectively prepared to rip up the fundamentals of competitive football in England and getting, reasonably close to having something they were going to do. And if it wasn't for not just the supporter reaction, but actually how that rippled out, then that might have been successful. Now, football competitions change all the time, and again, I'm getting slightly worried that I'm agreeing with Bill too much this evening, but and they will, and they'll continue to do so. But fundamentally with that, and I think Bill may well remember this as well, during that period then you had some Premier League clubs, a very small number in a particular camp, others in another camp, and the job that the Premier League had been able to do so very effectively as an organisation over a long time in corralling and keeping those together, it was broken at that point. And actually, that brings me to the point about why it is justified to have a body to be able to oversee some aspects of football. It's because the club's organisation, the competition organiser themselves, have been demonstratively unable to do it when it got to that crisis point. And that's where I think it's important to remember that when thinking about why do we have to do this, because during the process that then followed, there was a lot of discussion whether this is really necessary or can't we just do it ourselves. Actually, it precipitated some behaviour and some changes which have probably been quite positive. They probably wouldn't have been precipitated if the threat of the regulator hadn't been around there. So what do supporters want from the regulator? I think 3 things really. Firstly, to have a voice at the table, and because of this point, about it's not like any other customer, you can't just take your customer away. I'm not going to stop supporting Fulham because their ticket prices are horrendous and go and support Brentford. I mean, it's the last thing any rational person would do. But I do want
Support Brentford.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to be able to have a say, or to be part of a voice, to have those perspectives considered in the way in which people run the clubs, because the supporters are there forever. People who run clubs and own clubs, as Bill said, they want to sell the capital asset from time to time. They come and go. The supporters are the constant. Secondly, that the situation that I referred to in terms of Bury and Bolton, the situation that Sheffield Wednesday have been in most recently, there will be other clubs that, as far as we can, the regulator's in a position to help ensure that we know earlier rather than when it gets almost too late, so we avoid a crisis. I think that is a laudable aim, and that's something which I think is written through the whole of the discussion in the Croucher and everything that went beyond that in terms of government white papers and legislation. And thirdly, and importantly, the fundamentals of what makes the game in England so attractive is not jettisoned for what is perceived to be short-term gain and inevitable drive in football. So that's what I think supporters broadly want. Bill said, how many supporters think about financial fragility? Well, I can tell you supporters whose clubs have been in a very fragile space do think about it. They are concerned about it because it's almost brought their club either to go out of business or come very close to it. So it isn't that it's just completely ignored. It isn't that it isn't something that's important to supporters. And so I do think that second of the 3 points is actually fundamental to this, from supporters as well as from professionals in football. Challenges and opportunities, they're both. What I think the regulator needs to be able to try to do in the first 12 months really is properly establish what it's for, in a way that it's almost become a single transferable answer to every ill in football that it will be. The regulator will sort it. It won't, and nor should it. VAR it's a touch point, for example, that I'm sure the regulator is very glad not to have written in the legislation. No one should expect it to. But other fundamentals about the way in which football is structured and run and the impacts that can have on supporters is within the scope of the legislation, and that's really important. But there's not real clarity, I don't think, out there about what that's for. Secondly, and I think, given some of the people that have been appointed to various positions within the regulator, I've got a degree of confidence in this. I think they need to be able to demonstrate they're not to be messed with. I'm quite confident that will happen. And thirdly, I think to keep in mind that those who have habitually and not surprisingly be concerned with short-term gains and their short-term self-interest, which is what clubs will do naturally, that there is an entity there that is aware and acknowledges the bigger picture. I think that's really important because it's almost impossible for clubs to be able to articulate in any meaningful way. In a completely different context, someone said at the weekend, we are built on the loyalty, passion and commitment of those who follow us. That is absolutely true of football, it always will be, and that's going to be the way in which the regulator gets going.
Brilliant, lovely, thank you Tom, thank you all, lots to chew on there, lots of great questions coming through. If one of my colleagues from LCP has a microphone, and we'll be able to, would Gareth be able to stick his hand in the air as Gareth's got the top? Gareth's here. Can we have a microphone over here? You just keep your hand up, Gareth, if you wouldn't mind, please, just so my colleague can find you. Just before we come to Gareth, question initially for Tom, prompted by, you mentioned, in fact, a number of you mentioned the Conservative Manifesto of 2019, thinking about a Conservative Party of 2026, whether it would have a regulator created in a manifesto is an open question in my mind. Do you, and if I really snappy answers on this, do you think a regulator will actually survive a change of government? Could it actually be gone in 3 years' time?
I think that depends on how well it does in its first 3 years, frankly. If it proves that it's of value, then whatever an incoming change of government, if there is one, I think they'll have other things they want to focus on.
Okay, any thoughts?
Well, Toys made it clear fairly early on after coming back and took over the leadership that on her watch this was going to be a party that wouldn't create a regulator. Didn't quite say this party's going to get rid of them, but clearly it's been quite a shift. And Paul Stewart Andrew, who was sports minister when the Tories introduced the bill for the first time, had to go and endure all their sessions on the floor of the House and in committee, where Labour MPs and so on just read back the things he'd said about how wonderful this bill was. We got really sorry for him.
Okay.
And particularly the one when the first version of the bill fell, and he stood up and basically said to the then shadow, now sports minister, please continue with this, it's a really good idea. She quoted that back to him a few times.
Yeah, great. I was also thinking more radical changes in government, but I will park that. Gareth, if you can make sure the microphone's switched on, do ask your question.
Yeah, my question for the panel is just around sustainability really. It got touched on briefly by Bill about the bubble bursting. So, as a football fan myself, I'm looking at it and thinking, well, how can transfer fees, wages, ticket prices and TV deals all just go up forever? Because it seems every year the transfer record's broken, the wages go up, the ticket prices go up, and there's this little bit of doubt now about TV deals and whether they'll go up at the same rate. So does the panel think there is any sense of the bubble bursting?
Lovely, Gareth, thank you. Some nice snappy answers, please, Chris.
There's one sign, which might be a canary in the coal mine or might not be, but is that the amount of money that the Premier League generates for domestic TV rights is actually lower than it was in 2016-17. Now that's been more than offset by the growth in international TV rights, which are now the majority of the Premier League income. But all of the studies that I've seen seem to suggest that growth has come not because we're creating new football fans, but because we're cannibalising the ones that La Liga has or Bundesliga has or anything like that. So the domestic TV rights is perhaps the first indicator of a potential problem. I mean, David Cogan, the chair of the Independent Regulator, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but I hadn't thought of it in these terms until he said it, which is that something like 75–80% of the Premier League income comes from Comcast. And what happens to Comcast? Just change their mind or something. That was quite a sobering number.
Great. Any further thoughts?
Yes, forecasting the end of a broadcasting boom is, in defence of people taking an optimistic view, I would say that in the short to medium term, all the evidence is that live sport has particular qualities which are extraordinarily valuable and getting more and more valuable in a market that's swamped with choice. But live sport is a very restricted choice. There aren't that many mega live sports. And you know if you buy one as a broadcaster, it gives you a core of hours, in some cases all your hours that you broadcast, are from something that people will change the pattern of their day, the pattern of their weekend. They will change around that broadcast schedule. Everything else, films, dramas, soap opera, whatever, there are now thousands of replicas. The live sport still looks, medium term, good term.
Fair enough. Tom?
Longer term, Comcast points good one.
So I'm going to ask you a different question, if I may, from Mark O'Neill. Can wave Mark? Can we get the microphone? Just pass that on to Mark, please, on the end of the road, just over there. Just while you're doing that, Bart and I caught up with Dame Tracy Crouch last week, who unfortunately wasn't able to be with us. I think she's actually playing football or something like that. And we had a discussion with her about the right people to make up the regulator's staff. So, Tom, do you want to see footy nuts in the regulator? Do you want to see fans? Do you want to see people who are passionate about the game, or do you want to see technocrats, people who are good at holding billionaires to account? What's the right stuff?
I think, like with everything else, it's a balance and it's a mix. I think we will likely see people involved in the governance of the regulator who have a particular supporter perspective, and I think that's good. I think it's as important, if not more important, that the regulator in its work is properly engaging with supporters as well as other stakeholders. So I don't think it needs to be overly represented with supporters, as long as there is a proper process of reference to supporters.
Bill, Chris, any thoughts?
I mean, my view has always been that if what we're talking about is specialist market shaping financial regulation, the people at the regulator should be people who have experience of that more than they've got experience of football. That said, I've also always said that there needs to be a sprinkling of people, you know, as the phrase you used, grey hair long in the tooth, or experience of the industry and that kind of industry knowledge and street smarts to be able to advise the regulator.
Very good. So over to you, Mark. Your question.
Thank you. My question's quite simple ones, really. Do you think that a football club owner should be held to a higher ethical standard than a normal company director, as the rules currently imply?
So do we want particularly good people running football clubs?
Well, I don't know. I never know what's meant by ethical. I'm a lawyer.
Can we quote?
Yeah. But I think what we can expect and what we should do with football club owners is recognise that what they own is a cultural asset that existed long before them and hopefully will exist longer after them. In many ways, they are a custodian rather than an owner. So I think that's the sort of standard that should be applied to owners, and that should be in everyone's mind when they're thinking of the suitability of owners and owner conduct.
Yep.
Yeah, I think it's problematic. Measuring what you mean by a higher ethical standard is not an easy thing to do. I think the custodianship point is vital. However, you look at people and you say, Mike Ashley, very careful owner of Newcastle United, didn't take financial risks, wanted to make sure player trading was important, be net positive on that in terms of revenue and so on. But Mike was not massively popular. And there are risk-taking owners, seriously risk-taking owners, who, if they go on a run, or rather, much more importantly, if the club goes on a run, the team goes on a run, fans are energised and all the rest of it. It's really important that there's a balance here. Potential owners need to be encouraged to enter the market, and there needs to be a system. And I think the proposals that the regulator is in charge of bringing forward are sensible. things like looking at the business plan. Who knew that was a good idea? So there will be games, but the games are going to be around, I think, good business practice, like checking these people's business plan to make sure the numbers do to some extent add up, rather than a sort of ethical test. So I'm not sure that's there's a minimum ethical standard they need to be above, obviously, but beyond that, it's competence and responsibility mixed with ambition and caring about the club, rather than is this person a, as it were, morally good person.
Okay. Tom, as a fan, if you hear that a shady billionaire is taking over your club that's going to buy the best centre forward in Europe, you okay with that?
I'm not sure whether you refer to Shelley Carter as a shady billionaire, but that maybe you said
What's
that.
referred to in particular?
No, look, I think that the fundamentals of this are about, it's about recognition of what those owners, those directors are responsible for. And I think that, I'm quite confident that comes through the licensing approach that will protect those things and put in place those things. So it's not about being a higher ethical standard necessarily. It's actually about competence and suitability for the particular role you have in owning for a period a football club, because it's not the same as many other businesses, and that's a really important point.
I'm going to squeeze in a last question, then we'll wrap up. As this is anonymous, I'm going to ask it. Can we have some last snappy answers, gents, please? Will the regulator realistically be able to get clubs to comply with the rules it introduces? So you have to be licensed, you have your provisional license, like when you're a 17-year-old, I suppose, and then you have your proper license. But are they seriously going to revoke household name football club's license? Is it a credible threat? How, as the regulator, can get clubs to do what it wants and just go back in reverse order at the time?
Well, I think I referenced before, there's already many changes that happened just with the threat of the regulator. I think the regulators, as I said before, the things it needs to do in that first year, being shown that it's not going to be messed with, I think will precipitate good and better behaviour.
Correct.
I completely agree with that. I think regulators that operate in a way where 99 or 95%, being more realistic, of the job is done because you're there. It's the things that don't happen. It's the reason why I'm in favour, by the way, is police on the beat. It's not that they arrest a lot of people, they don't, but they don't stop a lot of things happening, and no one measures the things that don't happen when you have visible policing. Is there a general election pending? Am I a candidate? but you know what I mean? A good regulator is one that isn't reaching for its lawyers and racing to get people into court. Every now and then, though, the Admiral Byng principle turns out to be quite helpful, and you have to execute one every now and then. Bon corrige les autres.
Very good. Finally, Chris.
I mean, you asked the question on and you specifically raised the license. Do you think it's a realistic threat that anyone will ever get their license revoked? No, but I don't think that will happen. But I think that it doesn't need to happen because the statute gives the regulator very strong powers, very strong investigative powers. You know, it can enter a football club's premises under a warrant to take information. You know, that's the kind of information gathering powers that have never really existed in the game before. So it has strong powers that it can use if it needs to. So I think it probably won't revoke any licenses, but I don't think it needs to revoke any licenses.
Very good, gentlemen. Thank you for setting the scene. Please join me in thanking our panel. Short technical break for a couple of minutes to keep a West Brom fan in the chair. I'm passing on to Adrian Goldberg. So we'll have a comfort break after the second panel, but just a technical break for 5 minutes now.